In this lesson, we'll talk a little bit about some of the ways that we can sculpt our models in Mudbox. So we're just going to use this simple plane as an example here, and it's been subdivided a few times, so we've got a number of polygons here. So if we go down to our Sculpt Tools tray, you can see we have a number of tools that are going to enable us to sculpt our model in different ways. We've got our basic sculpt tool. So if I come in here, you can see that as I hover over, you can see I have a center point, and then I have kind of a radius, a circle here. And this is our brush size. Now we can change our brush size by looking over here under size, under the brush, the sculpt properties. We can change our size here, the slider. You can see that that changes the brush size. We can also hold down B, and you can see as I hold down B, this line appears in the center, and that is actually the strength. But if I hold down B and then click and drag, or if you have a tablet, push down and drag, you can change the brush size interactively. So very quick way of changing your brush size. Now you can also use the hotbox here and go to our brush size over on the left hand side here and change it that way as well. Okay, we can change the strength by hitting M and dragging, and that will change the strength, and you can see how that corresponds to the strength over there on the right hand side as those numbers change. So let's take a look at what we can do with just this simple sculpt tool. So if we create an initial stroke and we click and drag, and I'm just going to use a tablet, you can use a mouse as well. A tablet provides the extra pressure sensitivity that you can use here, but I'm just going to click and drag a stroke, move around the surface, and you can see that that raises that up from the surface. Okay, so sculpt, the default with the default settings, with this particular brush size, this particular strength will raise it up that amount. Now if we go ahead and reduce the strength, do the same thing, you can see how it doesn't pull it out quite as far. Now let's say instead of pulling out we want to push in, we don't have to change tools, we can just hit Control, do the same stroke, and that'll actually, instead of pulling out, it'll actually push into the surface. So you can very quickly toggle back and forth between pulling out, pushing in, just by changing up the keys that you're hitting. Okay. We also have fall offs that we can change, and by going to our fall off tray, you can see that we have some defaults that we can change. So if we select something like this fall off here, come in, and you can see that gives us kind of a sharp line up there on the top, or if we push in, kind of more of a crease. Okay. Whereas if we get something like this, it has a very rounded top but a very sharp transition into the bottom surface. Same thing here. So this line is sharp, but this is very soft inside. So the fall off, you can set use a fall off preset here, or you can go down under fall off in your properties and change the fall off yourself, so you can modify that manually. Okay. Now we can also use stamps and stencils to sculpt. So if we use a stamp, we can go to our stamps tray, we can select a particular stamp. So let's say we get something like this, just sort of a leaf texture here, and increase our brush size. You can see as we do one instance of that stamp, stamps down that image and uses that as our brush. If we start to drag this out, you can see it starts to lose that image, but it's using that stamp all along this stroke. And we can randomize the rotation, the position of our stamp to get something a little bit more like that, so we can randomize that. We can also increase the stamp spacing. So if we take that up to 100, you can see where it kind of stamps out individual instances of that stamp. Okay, and you can turn off your stamp just by going under stamp and turning it to off. Now stencil is going to be a little bit different. We can actually bring in a stencil, hitting S, and then using our mouse buttons we can move this stencil around, and here we're going to actually be able to sculpt through this. So just using a regular sculpt, we can come in here and sculpt through this, and this image stays in the same spot until we move it, so we can just go ahead and sculpt through that. Okay, and again we can turn that stencil off. Now we can invert, just as we did with our control key, we can invert the function of the sculpt tool if we want to, so that'll just reverse what it's actually doing, and we can also use mirroring to do that. Okay, we can also create a sculpt layer which will contain some sculpted detail on a particular layer, which we can turn off and on. So if we go into layers and sculpt, right now we don't have any layers, so we'll create a new sculpt layer. You can see that it has a strength here. So now let's say we want to modify this somehow. So we'll use the sculpt tool, get a smaller brush size and come in here. Let's get this fall off. No stamp. Okay, we'll sculpt something in like this. Now let's say we want to smooth this out. We could use smooth to come in and do that. Okay, we can also hold down shift and that will smooth out areas like that. So if we go in and create something like that, we can hold down shift to smooth that out. Okay, so control will invert what you're doing and shift will actually smooth it out. Okay, now the sculpting that we've done is basically contained on this particular layer. So instead of being on our plane, it's on our sculpt layer. So that means we can turn off just the detail that we've sculpted. Okay, we can also dial the strength in. So if we want to dial that down, if it's a little bit too much, we can dial the strength of that sculpt layer in. So it gives us a lot of flexibility when adding sculpted detail. Now there are a number of sculpting tools here which we won't be able to go through all of them. Grab is going to be a big one. If you want to go ahead and increase your brush size, this will allow you to click and actually move parts of your model around. So rather than dragging a stroke, wherever you click, you're going to just be kind of pulling that out or pushing it in. So you can really quickly do some shaping on your model using grab. Okay. We've got foamy, which will kind of get you this nice big stroke, which will raise that up or lower it down. You've got the ability to spray. So spray will apply your stamps. So if you want to add texture in a sort of random way, you can use spray. You can use repeat to add things like rivets. Okay, if you have a particular stamp that you're going to want to repeat over and over, you can repeat that. You can see how you can get those repeating patterns of that. Imprint will allow you to just drag one copy of your stamp and have that imprint into the surface. Okay, you've got a knife which you can sort of cut into the surface rather than sculpting. You can kind of cut in to the surface. Okay, so there are a number of different options here, along with also freezing, masking, and then erasing. Okay, and those sculpted details can be located on your mesh or they can be on a sculpt layer. All right, and your sculpt tool properties or any of these tool properties are going to be located over here. Remember, you can change the brush size by holding down B on your keyboard and clicking and dragging, changing the strength by holding down M and clicking and dragging. You can invert the functionality. Control will invert what you're doing. You can also use mirroring. If you want to mirror your detail, you can mirror that over using a different axis. So in this case, we're using the x-axis, so we're creating that mirrored detail on either side of that particular axis. And you can see as you select those, it'll show you what that axis is going to look like. All right, so play around with that. Use just a plane and start playing around with some of the strokes that you can create. Play with some of the different fall-offs. Play with some of the different stamps that you have. Play with some of the stencils. Remember that you can use S to move those stencils around, rotate them, move them around, scale them using the right mouse button. Middle mouse will move it around. Left mouse button will rotate it. Okay, if you want to turn that off, just hit off under stencil and you can sculpt through that. And just have a little fun playing with some of the sculpting tools that are available. Remember, sculpt, you can sculpt along a stroke. Grab will allow you to grab pieces of your mesh and move those around based on your brush size. If you've got a small brush size, then you're going to be moving a smaller piece around versus a larger brush size. So keep that in mind. Okay, so once you've played around with the sculpting a little bit on your own, in the next lesson we will talk a little bit about the basics of painting in Mudbox, so creating texture maps. So we'll go ahead and do that next.